We never should have gone inside that theater. There were 6 of us, eager for a thrill, a cheap scare on Halloween night. The old abandoned Rialto Theater had been a local ghost story for as long as I could remember. Its windows black as sin, the once grand marquee rotting away like a mouthful of broken teeth. Rumor had it the place closed down after a tragic fire years ago. But that wasn't what kept people away. No, it was something else. Something darker. You know how small towns are? Every kid had heard about the puppet master, the reclusive man who ran the shows night after night, with his eerie marionettes that seemed to move a little too fluidly, blink a little too often. People whispered that his creations were more than just wood and strings, that they had a life of their own. Some said he'd put a curse on the place before disappearing after the fire, leaving his puppets to rot in the dark, waiting for their master's return. We should have listened. The doors were surprisingly easy to open, old rusty but not locked. The moment we stepped inside, the air was different, thick with something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the dust or the decay, it was heavy, like the theater itself was watching us. "Come on," I said, trying to shake off the feeling. "It's just an old building, nothing to worry about." But as we moved further inside, the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. Shadows pooled in the corners so thick you couldn't tell where they ended and the walls began. The rows of seats, once plush, were now hollowed-out skeletons of their former selves, the fabric eaten away by time and rot. And at the front, the stage loomed like a gaping mouth. We were fools for laughing. Fools for thinking we could handle it. The others went ahead, but I hesitated, something drawing my eyes to the left, to the side stage. There was a door there, unmarked, barely noticeable in the gloom. I don't know why, but I felt pulled to it, like it was calling my name in a whisper, too quiet to hear, but too loud to ignore. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. It was cold, unnaturally cold. The kind of cold that bites through your skin and sinks deep into your bones. I shouldn't have opened it, but curiosity's a cruel thing, isn't it? Always digging at you, urging you to go a little further, even when you know you shouldn't. The door creaked open, and the smell hit me first. It was rancid, a mix of mildew and something else, something dead. I gagged, covering my nose, but the pull was still there, stronger now, as if whatever was behind that door had been waiting for me. And then I saw them. The puppets. They were lined up in neat little rows, their glass eyes staring blankly into nothing. Their faces, painted white with garish red smiles, seemed to leer at me. Some hung limply by their strings, others slumped over in chairs like they were just resting, waiting. All of them dressed in faded, old-fashioned clothes that hadn't been touched in decades. But the worst part was how human they looked, too human. I heard footsteps behind me and spun around, expecting one of the others, but there was no one there. Just the empty theater and the thick, suffocating quiet. That's when I noticed it, the faint rustling like the soft brush of cloth against wood. I froze, my eyes darting to the nearest puppet. It was one of the ones sitting in a chair, head slightly cocked to the side. Its mouth, painted into that awful eternal smile, twitched. No, I blinked, certain I'd imagined it. But then, ever so slowly, its head turned. The glass eyes, once staring blankly ahead, shifted toward me, locking on. My heart stopped. I stumbled back, knocking into a shelf, and suddenly they were all moving. All of them. Heads turning, eyes blinking, mouths twitching into grotesque smiles. And then I heard it, a voice soft at first, like a low hum of a forgotten melody. It came from the stage, from the shadows, and with it, the puppets started to rise, their strings jerking violently, their limbs bending in ways no human body could ever bend. The voice grew louder, filling the room, filling my head. "Welcome." The others came running, laughing at first, thinking I was trying to scare them, but their laughter died the second they saw the stage. Standing there, illuminated in the pale glow of the forgotten lights, was a figure. Tall, cloaked in shadow, holding a bundle of strings in his gnarled hands. The puppet master. We were trapped, and he wasn't alone. The puppets were coming for us. Their feet scraping against the floor in time with the song, their glassy eyes never blinking, their wooden hands twitching, reaching. We turned to run, but the doors, the same ones we'd walked through so easily, were shut. Locked. The lights flickered, plunging us into darkness for a moment, just long enough for the sounds of wood scraping closer. When the lights came back, 2 of my friends were gone. The seats where they'd stood were empty, as if they'd never been there at all. And the puppets. There were 2 more of them now, their faces eerily familiar, their eyes wide with terror, still human but trapped inside those wooden shells. I screamed, but no sound came out. The strings, oh God, the strings. They weren't just controlling the puppets. They were becoming the puppets. And there was no escaping the puppet master. Not now. Not ever. The marionettes lurched toward us, their limbs jerking in unnatural rhythms. And somewhere, hidden deep in the darkness, The puppet master smiled. It was our turn to take the stage. The smell of decay was thick, clinging to the back of my throat as we stumbled through the aisles, my legs moving on pure instinct. My mind was screaming, "Get out, get out." But every exit seemed to melt into the shadows, as though the theater itself was alive, conspiring to trap us. The stage behind us echoed with the sharp creak of wood, those puppets, their jerky, unnatural movements closing in. I couldn't see them, not clearly, but I could feel them. They were always just a step behind, their hollow footsteps in sync with the pounding of my heart. Every time I turned around, they were closer. Too close. "Where the hell are the others?" someone shouted, their voice ragged with panic. But I knew, deep down I knew. They weren't just gone. They were taken. Those faces, the familiar terror etched into those grotesque puppet smiles. They were still in there, still alive, but twisted, locked inside. The others hadn't realized yet. They still thought they could escape. But I knew. The puppet master didn't want us to leave. He wanted to play. Ahead of us, the lobby loomed like a promise of freedom. Someone ran for it, reaching out for the door handle. He slammed his body against the glass with a force that should have shattered it, but it didn't even budge. "It's locked!" he screamed, his voice breaking, wild with desperation. "No," I whispered, backing away from the doors. "It's not locked. We're sealed in." I could feel it. The theater wasn't letting us go. The walls were closer now, pressing in, breathing. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The Rialto had become a maze, shifting and closing off its paths, trapping us inside its rotting skeleton. The lights flickered overhead, the weak glow making the puppets appear in flashes, there 1 second, gone the next, always moving closer. Their hands reaching, mouths twitching in slow, deliberate motions, almost like they were laughing at us. And then the music started. It came from nowhere, yet it was everywhere. A soft, tinkling melody like something you'd hear in a forgotten nursery. Childlike, innocent, but with an underlying note of something far more sinister. The kind of music that crawls beneath your skin, making your heart race for no reason at all. The others were panicking now, scattering, searching for any kind of exit, any way out. But I stood frozen, transfixed by the melody. It felt like it was pulling me, coaxing me forward. And that's when I saw him again. The puppet master. He wasn't on the stage this time. He was sitting, perfectly still, in one of the audience seats, just watching. His long, gnarled fingers danced over the bundle of strings in his lap, pulling them ever so slightly, making the puppets jerk in response. His face was obscured in shadow, but I could see his smile, a crooked, unnatural thing that split his face in two. He didn't need to speak. I understood. We were his toys now. Before I could move, the lobby lights went out. Total blackness, thick and suffocating. And then click, a single spotlight appeared on the stage. Something dangled in the center of that spotlight. No, not something, someone. The light flickered, and I saw her face. It was one of my friends, strung up, suspended by invisible wires, her limbs twisted and bent in ways no human body should ever be able to move. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, but her eyes? God, her eyes were still moving. Wide, darting, pleading. The others screamed. Some ran, but I couldn't look away. She was alive. I could see it in her eyes, the pure terror, the fight still trapped inside her. But the strings controlled her now. She wasn't just dangling there, no, she was dancing, jerking back and forth to the sick, twisted melody the puppet master was playing. And then she wasn't alone. The lights flickered again, and now there were more. All of them. The ones we had lost. They hung from the rafters, their bodies limp, their faces painted with those same grotesque puppet smiles. But their eyes were still human, still aware. They moved together, a sickening marionette ballet. Their strings jerked and pulled, yanking them back and forth in violent, unnatural rhythms, their mouths twitching with every tug of the strings. I had to get out. I had to stop this. A crash echoed from behind us, metal scraping against concrete. One of the others had found a fire escape, prying it open with desperate strength. We bolted for it, every instinct screaming that we wouldn't get another chance. But before I could take more than a few steps, the music stopped. Dead silence. I looked back toward the stage. The puppet master was gone. The marionettes, all of them, hung in their places, lifeless. Their heads slumped forward, strings limp. For a moment, I thought it was over, that we were free. But then I felt it, something cold wrapping around my wrist. I looked down and froze. A string, thin, almost invisible, but unmistakable. It curled around my wrist like a serpent, pulling tight, and then it pulled. I screamed, but no sound came out. My legs buckled as the string yanked me backward, dragging me toward the stage, toward the puppets. My skin tore as I struggled, but it was no use. The harder I fought, the tighter it pulled, cutting deeper and deeper into my flesh. Above me, the lights flickered, and I caught a glimpse of him again. the puppet master, looming in the shadows, his smile wide, his hands weaving through the air like a maestro conducting a symphony of terror. I realized then it wasn't just the puppets he controlled. It was us. The strings tightened, pulling me toward the stage, toward those lifeless, jerking marionettes. My friends were screaming behind me, but I couldn't hear them anymore. All I could hear was the sound of the strings. And then the lights went out again. Total darkness. And in that darkness, I felt it. The cold bite of a string wrapping around my throat, pulling tighter, tighter. I wasn't leaving. None of us were. We were becoming part of the show. The darkness was suffocating, swallowing every sound except the whisper of strings tightening around my throat. I clawed at the invisible bonds, but they only bit deeper into my skin, dragging me ever closer to the stage, closer to them. I could feel the others around me, their panic like electricity in the air. Their voices rose and fell in the blackness, echoing off the walls of the theater, but they were as helpless as I was. The puppet master had us. He had us all, and we were dancing on his strings. The lights flickered again, but this time it was different. They came on in bursts, quick, disorienting flashes that illuminated the horror in front of me, then plunged me back into darkness. Each time the lights blinked, I saw more of the stage, more of the nightmare we'd walked into. There were more puppets now, dozens of them. And they were all hanging, suspended from the rafters like grotesque marionettes in some sick, twisted carnival. But it wasn't just their blank, staring faces or their limp bodies that sent my heart racing. It was the eyes that were still very much alive. I realized then that the puppets weren't just toys. They weren't just things the puppet master had created. They were people. People who had wandered into this cursed theater just like we had. People who had been trapped, transformed, twisted into the very marionettes we had mocked only hours before. And now it was our turn. A sudden movement to my left, one of the others trying to run. But it was no use. The strings found him, wrapping around his ankles, his wrists, pulling him off his feet. He screamed, but it was cut off by a sickening crack as the strings yanked him into the air, his body jerking unnaturally as though a giant hand was controlling him. The lights flickered again, and when they came back, he was gone. No, not gone. Hanging from the rafters, limp, lifeless, his mouth stretched into that awful, unnatural smile, and his eyes wide open, filled with terror, but completely silent. I didn't dare blink. Not now. Not when I knew what came next. The strings moved faster, tightening their hold, pulling us toward the stage. The others screamed, but it was like shouting into a void. The puppet master was playing us now, each of us a piece in his sick, grotesque play. My body jerked forward as the string around my neck pulled tighter, forcing me toward the other puppets. I dug my nails into the floor, my fingers scraping against the rotting wood, but it didn't matter. The strings pulled harder, lifting me off the ground, dragging me into the air like a rag doll. I was becoming one of them. My feet dangled above the stage, my body moving on its own, twitching and jerking as though I was nothing more than a marionette, my strings being pulled by unseen hands. The others were beside me, their bodies suspended, their faces contorted in terror, but they weren't screaming anymore. None of us were. We couldn't. The puppet master stood in the wings, his gnarled hands weaving through the air, controlling the strings with delicate precision. His eyes were dark, empty voids that reflected nothing, but I could feel his gaze on me, on all of us. And then, with a snap, the strings released me. I fell to the stage with a thud, gasping for breath, my body convulsing from the strain of whatever had been done to me. I could hear the others collapsing around me, their bodies hitting the ground like sacks of meat. For a moment, I thought we were free, that it was over. But it wasn't. As I lay there, struggling to catch my breath, I felt it. Something cold and sharp brushing against my skin. I lifted my head, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw them. The puppets. But they weren't hanging anymore. They were moving, on their own, their glass eyes locked onto us, their painted faces grinning grotesquely as they shuffled forward, their wooden limbs creaking with every step. I scrambled back, my hands slipping on the slick stage floor, but they were everywhere, closing in from all sides, their eyes hungry, their fingers twitching. One of them reached me first, its hand closing around my ankle with a grip like iron. I kicked, but it didn't let go. More of them swarmed in, their cold hands grabbing at me, pulling me toward the center of the stage, toward the puppet master. He stood there, towering over us, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. He raised one hand, and the puppets froze, their heads snapping up in perfect unison to look at him. And then, with a voice like creaking wood, he spoke. "You were always meant to be part of the show." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was raw, my voice stolen by the terror that gripped me. The puppets dragged me forward, their faces grinning wider with every step, until I was right in front of him. His fingers brushed my face, cold and dry like old parchment. He leaned in close, his breath foul with the stench of death. "You'll make a fine addition," and then he smiled. That's when I heard it, a soft, whispering sound behind me. I turned my head, just in time to see the others, the ones who had been strung up like puppets, rising to their feet. But they weren't my friends anymore. Their eyes were empty, lifeless. Their bodies moved in jerky, unnatural motions, their mouths twisted into those same awful puppet smiles. I tried to crawl away, but the puppet master held me still, his grip tightening around my throat. He whispered something then, something low and guttural that I couldn't understand, but it sent ice shooting through my veins. The others, my friends, started to move toward me, their puppet limbs bending at impossible angles, their fingers reaching out, and I knew in that moment what he meant. We were becoming the puppets. The strings weren't just pulling us, they were becoming us, embedding into our skin, our bones. I could feel them now, burrowing deeper, twisting through my flesh like barbed wire. And I couldn't stop it. No one could. The strings tightened, digging into my skin, and the world around me seemed to close in. My friends, once living, breathing people, now twisted, lifeless marionettes, shuffled toward me, their empty eyes reflecting nothing but the puppet master's control. His cold hand gripped my shoulder, pinning me in place, while my body fought a losing battle against the invisible strings coiling deeper into my flesh. For a moment I surrendered. I let the terror consume me. I believed that this was it, our fate sealed, our bodies turned into puppets for eternity, controlled by a madman who reveled in our suffering. But then something shifted. A voice, soft, barely a whisper, cut through the chaos. It wasn't the puppet master's. It was familiar, a voice from the past. "You can fight it," the voice said. "You don't belong here, remember who you are." Suddenly, memories flooded back. My friends laughing, not twisted in horror. The times we had spent together before this nightmare began. I remembered the warmth of our lives, the joy, the bond that had brought us here in the first place. And I remembered something else, the power of choice. The puppet master had taken everything from us, twisted our minds, but he couldn't take that. "You don't control me," I whispered, the words weak at first, but they grew stronger. "You don't own me." The puppet master's smile faltered just for a second, and in that brief hesitation, I realized something. His power came from our fear, our belief that we were trapped, helpless. But fear wasn't enough to control us. Not if we didn't let it. I tugged against the strings, my fingers gripping the invisible bonds with a strength I didn't know I had. The strings bit into my skin, but I didn't stop. I wouldn't stop. "You don't control me!" I shouted, and this time the strings loosened, just a little. The puppet master's eyes, once cold and calculating, widened in surprise. He pulled harder on the strings, trying to force me back under his control, but I could see the cracks forming in his confidence. The puppets around me, my friends, staggered, their jerky movements faltering as though the power holding them was weakening. I wasn't the only one fighting. The others were breaking free too. I could feel it. They weren't lost. Not yet. I reached out, grabbing one of them, my closest friend, and pulled, hard. The strings around their bodies snapped like brittle threads, and for the first time since entering the theater, I saw life return to their eyes. They gasped, their body collapsing into mine, but I didn't let go. I wouldn't let them fall. "We can do this," I whispered, pulling them to their feet. "We just have to fight." One by one, the others followed. We ripped the strings from our skin, from our minds, until we were no longer puppets, no longer bound by the puppet master's twisted control. The theater trembled around us, the very walls shuddering as though the place itself was losing its grip on reality. The puppet master shrieked, a high, piercing sound that made the air vibrate. His once commanding presence shriveled before our eyes, his body seeming to age, to rot, as his hold over us slipped away. "You can't escape," he rasped, his voice barely audible now, a shadow of the power it had been. But he was wrong. We weren't his puppets anymore. We were free. With one final, desperate pull, the last of the strings snapped, and the puppet master collapsed, his body crumbling into dust as the theater around him dissolved. The lights flickered wildly, the old wood groaned and creaked, and then, as if a veil had been lifted, the doors behind us burst open. The fresh night air hit me like a wave, filling my lungs with the cool scent of freedom. We stumbled out into the street, bruised, battered, but alive. The Rialto Theater, that cursed place, stood behind us, silent and dark, as if the evil that had inhabited it was gone. For good. We stood there for a moment, looking at each other in disbelief. We had survived. We had beaten him. My friend, the one I had pulled free first, turned to me, their eyes still wide, but now filled with relief. "We made it," they whispered, their voice shaking with emotion. "We're okay," I nodded, my chest tight with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. Yeah, I said, my voice hoarse. We're okay. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to smile. We had faced the puppet master. We had fought his control, and we had won. As we walked away from the theater, leaving the horrors of that night behind us, I glanced back one last time. The building was still there, old and crumbling, but the darkness that had lived inside it was gone. The air felt lighter, clearer, as if the puppet master's grip on this world had finally been severed. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt hope. We were free. We had saved each other. And as long as we remembered that, no darkness, no puppet master could ever control us again. We had broken the strings, and we would never, ever be his puppets again.